This is part 3 of Unit 6, and today we're going to get a little bit more into the actual war part of the Civil War rather than kind of what's leading up to it. We're not going to be able to have the time to go through all of it extensively and go through a lot of the battles. A lot of that you can do on your own, but we're going to kind of give you a general outline or a general timeline of kind of the events, and then a little bit about what it was like for the typical soldiers. Okay, so let's start with the timeline. And one of the things I'd like you to understand and remember is that really the Civil War is kind of two wars going on at the same time. We have the war in the East. That's the one that we're probably more familiar with. That's General Lee against various Union commanders. The famous battles there would be Gettysburg, of course, Antietam. These battles are pretty well known to a lot of you. But there's also the war in the West. And the West is fought primarily over control of the Mississippi River, which is a very important waterway and transportation route. And whoever controls that has a distinct advantage. So there's really two battles here, the war in the East, something to kind of keep in mind. Now, for the South, their strategy from pretty much the very beginning had been a defensive war. Their idea or strategy was just to basically survive or exist. If we exist long enough, if the North doesn't come in and crush us and force us to go back into the Union, then we'll be able to form our own country. Much the same way that the United States kind of tried to do that in the Revolution against England. England being more powerful, the United States just tried to exist and keep the revolution going, and eventually thinking that the British would quit, which is kind of what they did. And that's what the South is trying to do here. They're trying to hold on long enough so the North just says the heck with it and lets the South go form their own country. So the South is fighting throughout most of the war a defensive war. They're just trying to keep out invaders, just trying to keep their nation intact. Now the North has to be more aggressive. They're the ones that want to force someone to do something, so they are a little bit more aggressive, and their strategy is known as the Anaconda Plan. The anaconda being a snake that squeezes its prey. And that's what they're going to try to do to the South. They're going to use their Navy, which they had a very good Navy, and the South pretty much had none. So they're going to use their Navy to make it very hard for the South to get goods in or out. They're going to blockade them and slowly squeeze the South. And then they're going to try to go and take control of the Mississippi River, which would split the South into two parts and basically slowly squeeze their prey till they have to give up because they can't fight anymore. That's the North's plan. Okay. The first Union general, or first commander for the North, is a guy named McClellan. He's pretty famous for the war. He's a very good soldier. He's very good at organizing. He whips the North into shape. Remember, the North has thousands of volunteers. He trains them well and things like that. But his big drawback is he's very, very cautious. He often is so anxious not to make a mistake that he analyzes things. He thinks that there's more Confederate troops than there usually are, and so he doesn't react fast enough. And there's a couple times where he could have really ended the war sooner, or maybe dealt a really big blow to the South, but he's so cautious he doesn't follow things up enough because he's afraid of making a mistake that might make him look bad or might ruin his political career, because he later does run for president actually against Lincoln. That he doesn't take a lot of the necessary steps to win well. So he doesn't last very long because he's too cautious, and that'll kind of be a theme in the North. They're going to go through a lot of commanders early on until Lincoln finds Grant, who he settles on, basically saying, I can't spare this guy because he fights. The 7 Days Battle is one of the early battles. What's significant to know about this is when the South starts to deviate a little bit from that defensive strategy. As you can see on the board here is where the South starts to get a little bit more aggressive, and that's significant because when they do that, that's when things start to slide downhill a little bit. Once they won this battle and the North had to retreat, and there were several times where the North tried to invade the South and capture Richmond or to deal a big blow to the South to kind of hurt the Confederacy, and was pushed back by the South. After this battle, the South was feeling pretty confident, and I can see here on the board that Davis, the president of the Confederacy, really didn't want to do this. He was a former graduate of West Point, and so he understood strategy and military matters, but there was a lot of pressure from politicians and the people because the South knew that they could only last out so long, and so they were getting really confident. They were always winning these battles against the North, and so they wanted to kind of push the envelope, so to speak, and see if they couldn't end the war a little bit faster and maybe on better terms than what they had even hoped for at the beginning of the war. So Davis is kind of forced to be more aggressive, even though he doesn't want to, and that's going to be significant because it's going to lead to some things. Okay? Now, the Battle of Antietam is one of the major battles here. This is considered to be a northern victory, but it really is bloody on both sides. It's a northern victory because they killed more people than the Southern Army did, and because the North kind of wins at the end of the day, they're in control of the field. But really, militarily, it's kind of a standoff. It probably, if you're the South, you'll lose a little bit more because you just don't have as many troops as the North does. But the Battle of Antietam is in Maryland, and in Maryland, you might remember, is a border state, and this is kind of one of those times when the South starts to creep up to the North, and the North has to push them back. And in doing so, the South loses a little bit too many troops. And a good example of that is at the Battle of Antietam here. They did deal a big blow to the Union, but the Union can absorb military losses better than the South can because the Union has higher population. They can replace the soldiers where the South has a harder time doing that. What's most important to know, however, about the Battle of Antietam is that is when Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which is a document that frees slaves, but only in states that are in rebelling. So it doesn't free the slaves in the borderline states because he's afraid they'll leave then, and that would be, you know, very hurtful to keeping the Union together. So he only frees them in the states that are in rebellion, which is kind of interesting or ironic because obviously he doesn't really have the power to do that. He's way up in the North and says these people are free, and of course they're hundreds of miles away in enemy territory. It's hard for him to really enforce that. But what it is it's a symbolic gesture. And what it does is it turns, as you can see here, it turns the war into a moral war. This is when it becomes a war to end slavery. Before, it was a war to preserve the Union, or if you're a Southerner, to keep your way of life. It was for states' rights, to live the way you want to. Now it's more of a moral war, right versus wrong, slavery or not slavery. And this gets a lot more people on board in the North because abolition is a pretty big movement there, as you remember. And when he does this, that gets a lot more support for the North, and it basically ends the chance of the South getting any help from foreign countries because now it becomes more about slavery than ever before, and most countries don't like slavery, like Britain and France, for example. Gettysburg is probably the most famous battle of the war. It is considered to be the turning point of the war, which is what you need to know. In 1863, again, the South invades the North, and they're trying to get a quick end to the war. And so what the strategy is Lee's going to fight a battle and get in between the Army and Lincoln in Washington, D.C., so that the Army of the North has to attack, destroy them, and then he's going to give a letter to Lincoln asking for peace. That's the plan. But of course, oftentimes in war, things don't go according to plan. And Lee, who basically was brilliant up until this point, made the mistake of attacking, and he lost so many troops he really kind of crushed the South's chance for victory. The most famous part of the battle is Pickett's Charge, which is the third day of battle, where the South makes one final push to try to break through the Union lines, and it ends up being kind of a suicide mission. These Union troops attack a fortified area of Union troops and basically just get slaughtered out in the open, and it is kind of really the beginning of the end, and that's why Gettysburg is a turning point. It's just basically the South loses too many men and material, and it's the beginning of the end for their army. They're no longer going to be able to go on the offensive. They're going to be really, really defensive now, even more than before. They're just running out of people and equipment, and they remember, because of the blockade, they can't get a lot of supplies, and they're also running short of money. So, and they're running short of food and things. In fact, one of the famous stories at Gettysburg is a lot of the action there takes place early on. The Confederates are attacking towns looking for shoes. They're looking for shoes because they don't have any. What else is significant to know about Gettysburg is one of Lincoln's probably most famous speeches, if not the most famous speech. And when I was in school, I actually had to memorize this. This is the Gettysburg Address, which is basically given as a kind of an olive branch to the South, basically saying, you know, we all were brave, we all fought here, and this is still be a great nation of the people and by the people, and kind of hoping to tell people that when this is all over, when this great war is over, we're going to have to recognize that loss was on both sides and come back together and realize we're still Americans, and we're going to have to heal the wounds of the nation. And that's what he was hoping to do with this speech at this commencement of the cemetery for these guys that fought here. War in the West, that's where we first find Grant. Grant is a very interesting person. He's a failure at pretty much anything but being a soldier. When the war breaks out, he's working for his father-in-law as a clerk in a general store, and he's causing the store to go bankrupt, actually. And he is discovered in the West fighting many battles. He wins some significant ones, the Battle of Vicksburg, Cold Harbor. But the thing about Grant is sometimes it's considered to be kind of cold because he doesn't seem to care anyway, about how many men he loses in the process. He just realized that the North has more numbers than the South. If we just keep fighting and we keep having the South just lose men, eventually we're going to win because they won't be able to fight anymore. And so war in the West is when Grant is discovered, and Lincoln brings him out to the east to take on Lee and to try to end the war. Shiloh and Vicksburg were the biggest battles of the West. Again, the battle in the West basically revolves over control of the Mississippi River, which is that huge important transportation route. The South relied on that to get goods back and forth, their precious cotton, for example, but also move troops and things like that. And remember the Anaconda Plan, it would split them in two. So Grant ends up winning the Battle of Vicksburg, which splits the South into two, and that really cripples them. And after those victories, it's kind of when Lincoln calls for him to come east, and he takes over the battle on the east. Few things here to wrap up. One of the most important things to remember about the Civil War is Sherman's march to the sea. General Sherman is under Grant. He's one of his subordinates, and he leads a path of destruction across the state of Georgia. And what's important to know about this is a couple things. One is it's an example of something that developed during the Civil War called total war, which is where you do anything and everything to win. And before, wars were really confined to just fighting between professional soldiers or professional armies. Now total war is we're going to take away the enemy's will to win. We're going to attack civilian towns. We're going to destroy anything that the army, our enemy army, could use as a benefit, whether that be shelter, food, railroads, anything. And this is why sometimes the Civil War is often called the first modern war, because we have some of the first modern techniques in here, where Sherman is trying to destroy the morale of the civilians as well as the soldiers. If we get the civilians to want to quit, they'll put pressure on the politicians to surrender, which will end the war. So we're basically, Sherman is taking his troops and destroying anything in the South of value. Sherman bow ties, for example, were railroad ties that were heated and then bent around telephone poles, or telegraph poles. They're destroying everything. Cotton, telegraph poles, livestock, fields, anything that the enemy can use is going to be destroyed. And again, it's a waging war against civilians as well as soldiers. Doesn't mean he goes in and kills civilians, but he's hurting them in a way that makes them want to surrender. Now, why is this so important? Well, one, because it's an example of total war, but two, also because it makes Yankees really hated in the South. This is something that's going to be remembered for a long, long time, this path of destruction, and it's going to lead to a lot of hurt and distrust between the two sides. After the war is over, it's going to make the reuniting more difficult, and it's going to be something that's going to crop up in our history from time to time. That's why we need to be aware of it. The war kind of officially ends at Appomattox Courthouse. That's where Lee surrenders to Grant. There's a few skirmishers after that, a few things after that, because it took a while to get the word out, and then there's some diehards that don't want to give up. But basically, Lee surrenders to Grant. His troops are just starving to death, and he can't fight anymore. And he knows that it's useless. The North just has too much resources and too many men. And as I said, his guys are starving, so it doesn't make a point to continue. And so he surrenders. And it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of interesting little stories involved with Appomattox. Grant, as you may or may not know, is kind of rumored to be this rough guy. He's often rumored to be drunk. He's not very kempt. He doesn't shave all the time. He arrives, he's got mud on his boots. He just looks scruffy. He doesn't look very professional. Where Lee, on the other hand, is a by-the-book kind of guy. He shows up and he's beaming. Everything is polished. Everything, he looks the Southern gentleman. And so it's kind of like these two worlds are kind of coming together and colliding here. Oh, well, it's just an interesting contrast of the war. Another interesting story is that you might remember the first battle of Manassas or Bull Run. The guy that lived on that farm after the battle took place actually sold it and moved, and they actually signed the peace then on his property again here at Appomattox. So a nice little interesting beginning and end. So interesting little story here. But that's kind of the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse. And the South doesn't get a whole lot. But Grant is kind of nice when he meets Lee and really gracious and isn't too harsh on the South. And that's going to be kind of the theme, is what to do with the South now that the war is over. Are we going to punish the heck out of them, or are we going to kind of be forgiving and try to be a little nice to them so it makes the healing process easier? The last little bit I want to talk about here, what was it like to be a soldier during the war? We'll talk about this, of course, in your seminar. This is one of the questions you had to research. As you can see, the life expectancy is not good, only 6 months. The Civil War is a very, very bloody war. More Americans die in the Civil War than any other war. Of course, that's because we have Americans on the North and the South as well. But it was very, very bloody, very, very violent. Unfortunately, a lot of the deaths came from disease. Medicine was not very developed at this time, so oftentimes when you were shot or injured in battle, you didn't die from those wounds, but you died from the infection that came because of the wounds, and they didn't understand a whole lot about diseases and germs and things like that. So often I would work on one soldier as a medical doctor, and then I wouldn't even wash my hands or my instruments before I worked on another one. And so oftentimes I spread disease and infection in that way. So most of the people that died did not die from gunshot wounds or battle wounds. They died actually from complications of those wounds, or from diseases they got while in camp because they weren't in clean areas as well. Very physically demanding, a lot of marching, heavy packs. They're wearing wool uniforms and they're fighting in the hot summer sun. For example, Gettysburg takes place over the 4th of July. So imagine wearing a wool uniform that's dark and you're out in 100-degree temperatures or very high humidity, if nothing else. So it's very physically demanding. A lot of marching, moving around is a big part of your day. And it's very emotional too. You know, brother versus brother was very common, but you often were fighting people you knew, friends you knew from before the war. Especially the officers often knew people on either side. But that was very common for you to be fighting not only family, but friends, people that you knew before the war. And now you're fighting against them. So it really tears people up emotionally. And of course, it's just the fact that our country is falling apart too. But again, it's emotional because you know people on both sides. The North in particular really struggled early on with their leaders, and a lot of the soldiers lost heart and had a difficult time fighting. They didn't have the fighting spirit because of their commanders were so poor. Now the South, on the other hand, the commanders down there were almost like revered as gods because they could do no wrong. Stonewall Jackson and General Lee in particular. But the North, you know, endured bloody loss after bloody loss after bloody loss. And imagine what you must feel when your commander says you've got to go do this, and you know 3/4 of the people around you are going to die when you do it because you know it's stupidity. But if you don't, you're going to get shot for not obeying orders. So the North had that burden. At least the South leaders were competent, where the North often early on were not. And so they had that burden as well, knowing that we're often marching to our death or destruction. As I mentioned a little bit ago, poor medical facilities was very, very common. Often operating out in the open or a shack. Dust, debris would constantly get into things. They just didn't understand a whole lot. Often the most common treatment is to just amputate something. That was the most common way to save someone's life. They might get hit in the arm here and they would just amputate them, or in the leg or whatever. That was the common solution to the problem, because that was usually resulted in the least amount of deaths. Sometimes they're operating these people, they have nothing to put these people under with, so they're digging into you, trying to get fragments of shell or bullets or whatever out of your body with you wide awake. It's just nasty, nasty stuff. And I got some clips on this that we'll see in class a little bit as well. Okay? Long periods of doing nothing. There's a long periods of in-between battles. Oftentimes it takes a while to move the soldiers around, because primarily they're still moving on foot, even though railroads are being played here. That's another reason it's kind of called a modern war. But there's long periods of boredom, and you can see that led to the development of baseball. Baseball was one of the favorite pastimes of the soldiers, especially in the North. Abner Doubleday from the North wrote down some of the first organized rules for baseball. He was a soldier in the North, and that's oftentimes what people did. Prostitution was common. Sometimes people had their families with them, so you would have your children and wife in tow. Music was very common, singing, but also musical instruments. But those were some of the things that they did: reading the Bible, writing. But there was long periods of doing nothing, and it's kind of interesting that baseball comes out of that. We wouldn't necessarily think of that. One of the horrors of the war is the prison known as Andersonville. This is a prison down south, so this was for Union troops, and this was just like more or less a Holocaust concentration camp. You're crowding people together in cramped quarters that aren't made for it. There's very poor sanitation, lack of food, and so that's just a horrific condition. And this is a kind of a, like I said, kind of like a concentration camp that you might find in World War II. And it wasn't because the South was trying to be mean or punish them. They just simply didn't have the facility big enough to watch all these people. And so that was a constant problem too, is you take soldiers prisoners, what do you do with them? And in the South they sent them to this place known as Andersonville, but it was just not equipped to handle as many people, and it was just horrific. There's stories of, people dying in the thousands from disease. They would go to the bathroom and then drink out of the same stream that ran through the camp. Just these horrible things, and of course lack of food and just all kinds of nasty things. Again, the closest thing I could compare it to would be a concentration camp, which you probably are a little bit more familiar with. Because life was boring and because it was dangerous, desertion was a pretty common problem, both North and South. Many people deserted, which of course if you deserted and were caught, you were executed. That was a crime, that was a treason. But again, a lot of it is simply people had to go home to do work, especially in the South. Most of the guys that were fighting had these farms, and they were afraid, hey, if we're not there, who's going to harvest our crops? How are our family going to eat? And oftentimes they were promised just, they only had to fight 6 months out of the year and then they could go home. Well, sometimes those privileges would be revoked and then they would try to desert anyway. But just know that desertion was fairly common on both sides, not just in the South or in the North. And then finally, draft. This was the first time that people were conscripted into the Army, forced to join the Army. This was primarily in the North, but the South did this as well. The South had a little bit more peer pressure to kind of get people, but it was used in both the North and the South. But in the North, one of the things that was really bothering people was that you could buy your way out if you were drafted. If you had $300 in the North and you were drafted, you could give the $300 and wouldn't have to go. They'd find your replacement. Now, $300 to us doesn't sound like much, but in the 1860s, $300 was a tremendous amount of money, which is why it led to, as you can see on the board, riots. It's because the poor people obviously couldn't come up with this. This was just intended for rich people, a way to save their skins or the skins of their sons. And so there was a lot of resentment because of that. And especially when the war doesn't go very well, there is some animosity or hatred or anger towards the war and towards the draft in general. Why should I have to go do this? I'm just going to die, and so on and so forth. And so New York City had a huge draft riot, the largest one. There were others, but New York City, it was the worst, and it was primarily over this buyout. But the crowd was just angry and frustrated, and so they lashed out, particularly at blacks, obviously, but also just shops in general, or anything in general that reeked of government control. And actually it took the winning soldiers from Gettysburg, many of them had to march to New York City to put the riot down because it was so bad. It was very, very gruesome and very, very destructive. So that's a little bit about the Civil War, kind of give you a quick timeline, real quick. Again, unfortunately we don't have time to go through many of the battles and in great detail of the battles. We'll do a little bit more about that hopefully during the seminar and a little bit in class, and then a little bit about the actual life of a soldier. As you can see, it wasn't really pleasant. It was pretty difficult, but there were times of great boredom and lack of things to do, which was interesting as well. Probably the most important thing to remember about the soldiers at the time is most of them died from diseases or infection than fighting in battle, although the war was very destructive for that as well. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. So that's the end of part 3 of Unit 6.